in sociology. And that's a lot, I think, in terms of getting that critical thinking skill. I think Khensani just does that naturally. So just to introduce Khensani in the way that I mean, you made a very brief bio, but you're much more than this. But Khensani is a Johannesburg-based fiber artist, researcher, and content creator. You can see a lot of our articles on Twig as well, focusing on South African fashion history. Her work looks to find and amplify lesser known narratives on how historical fashion or South African have utilized dress and textiles for cultural preservation, environmental stewardship, and intra-cultural dialogue. So particularly in response to and against colonial and apartheid systems. She brings this to modern audiences on social media, documenting her learnings and findings while attempting to recreate and reinterpret historical and cultural garments. It's really beautiful to see. She utilizes either original practices or combines them with contemporary reconstruction and repurposed and upcycled material. So everybody, please give a round of applause to Khensani. Enjoy.
Yeah. Cool. Nice intimate vibes. VIPs only. So hi everybody. Very briefly, I am very, very into fashion history. So I went to fashion school quite a long time ago now, getting in the years. And one of the things I found a little bit sort of like disconnected about the experience was sort of the lack of like a fashion history. Am I so close?
No, opposite.
Okay.
Give it to you there.
I was gonna use like my drama skills.
Yes, use the intercoffee breathing, yeah.
But I didn't enjoy my I didn't enjoy parts of my fashion education just because I felt, especially in terms of a lot of the history and the theory elements, were quite Eurocentric, which I didn't think really made sense as a person living in Africa. I didn't feel like there was enough extensive knowledge available to me about practices, customs, philosophies, design thinking, specifically on the African continent. I think in other parts of Africa, they do this a lot better than us. I think part of this is probably because we're still a very young nation. We're like one of the last to get liberated. So it does bring me to trying to think a lot and find this information for myself. And right now, I think is one of the best times if you are anyone in the sort of African fashion industry. We're having quite a like renaissance, a boom. Like if you think about some of the biggest designers in the world right now, we have South African and Nigerian winners of the LVMH prize, like Tebe Magugu, some of the biggest shows at London Fashion Week, Paris Fashion Week, New York, Milan. You know, we've got Kenneth Eze, Tokyo James, Makosa Banuduma, Orange Culture. Yeah, the list goes on. And it's easier than ever before to know these names, to see them in mainstream media, to see them with celebrities and red carpets. There's also recognition on the sort of academic and museum side. So about like 2 or 3 years ago, the V&A Museum in the UK had the exhibition Africa Fashion, which is probably the most comprehensive and extensive exhibition on historical African fashion. And they were covering iconic designers, photographers, figures, textiles of the 20th century. So things like commemorative cloth, looking at one of the sort of the continent's first female designers, Sade Thomas Pham, looking at the way clothing and fashion was so tied to liberation movements. When we think about like the Year of Africa, which is 1960, so that's about like I think 10 or 12 African countries that year got their independence from colonization, and a big part of them forming and shaping their identity in this liberated post-colonialism world was through reviving textile industries, through returning to old crafts, through combining history and culture with this new modern context. So yeah, that all just goes to say things are very exciting right now. I think also like one of the first Black women to win an Oscar for costume design was Ruth E. Carter, and that was for her work in Black Panther. And that's a really great film on a costume level in the way that she had the challenge of trying to dress a nation that had never been colonized, didn't have any interaction with Western superpowers, and trying to imagine how that would look, and then drawing from a lot of indigenous practices from across the continent. There's things like the Sutu heritage blankets there. You see some really beautiful Maasai beading. She makes amazing references to the warriors of Dahomey and so on. Yeah, so that's just to say that like it's a really good time to sort of be in the African fashion industry. But since we are sort of in the zeitgeist at the moment and a lot of the world is looking to Africa, it makes me think about then like what does it mean to be in African fashion, to be an African designer? And I know that's a bit of a sort of contrived question because I guess you would never ask the same thing of like the West, right? You would just kind of accept that. But I actually think it's quite a good question to ask because I think that one of the things that has made the fashion industry worldwide today so terrible, why we're faced with so much human rights injustices, with the environmental warfare, with a hyper consumptive culture, where we, treat clothes as throwaway objects, is because we've sort of lost meaning and value in clothing and in fashion. There was a time, before the Industrial Revolution where everyone was very, very closely connected with their clothing. If not knowing how to make it themselves, you were neighbors or related to your tailor, to your costumer. You had a very deep insight of what it took to make a garment, the labor that went into it. It's a knowledge that a lot of us don't have today, unless you're like studying fashion design or you've grown up in that environment. I don't think most people even know how to like differentiate different fabrics or read the labels on the like little washing label thing. Um, that's just a very big disconnect. And obviously that had to happen in order for us to have this hyper industrialized system, because the less clothing means the less we value it and the easier it is to keep consuming more and to throw away more. So I think it's very important as we move forward. And like Colin was mentioning earlier, we have the benefit in Africa of being able to do things right the first time. We don't have to work backwards. We don't have to start anew. We can continue forward in a really great way. So we have that really great advantage to us right now. So I think it's very important for all of you in whatever sector you're going to be to really be thinking about how you want to shape your industry and what you want it to look like. And I like to look to sort of history for examples of this. Also, just like Colin had mentioned earlier, a lot of the practices that you see encouraged in a lot of sustainability conversations about, minimizing waste as much as possible, about using your waste, about consuming slowly, about careful labor, about conscious craft, about, really thinking about the way you clothe and dress yourself. These are things that people of the global south have been doing forever, and Europe even as well until a certain point, like before the Industrial Revolution. But because this is a very big continent, it is quite hard to sort of come up with sort of a single like African fashion philosophy. There's over 54 countries, each with like hundreds of language groups and ethnicities and tribes. But I do think there are like a few themes that keep coming up again and again. And I think I'd like to sort of present them in a way for you to start thinking about African fashion as a whole, about the work you do, or even the way you engage with the way you dress yourself or your wardrobe. Um, and a lot of this I like to sort of view as from the lens of cultural sustainability, even though I kind of see that also still fitting into environmental sustainability, because caring about the environment is also caring about the people in that environment, as well as the water and the air and the land. But in terms of cultural sustainability, this is also speaking more specifically to um, things that are unique to different groups of people. So different crafts, artisanal skills, artisanal groups. So, South Africa, we're quite adept in beading and leather work. We have this amazing homegrown wool industry that we don't get to utilize as much of because unfortunately we don't have as many textile mills anymore. But all fun things for you guys to possibly reimagine in the future. But yeah, so to take you on this sort of thinking thing, just by like a quick show of hands, how many of you guys are familiar with Dapper Dan? I need to read up on Dapper Dan. So yeah, it's gonna be a little bit backwards, but just trust me. So I'm gonna talk about an American designer to talk about some African fashion philosophy. But just because Dapper Dan is like a really, I think, digestible contemporary example of some of these ideas. Um, the quick crash course for everyone. Dapper Dan, he's kind of known as like the Harlem couturier and almost sort of the godfather of streetwear and a lot of what we associate with clothing of like rappers and hip hop and like the urban scene. So he got very popular in the 80s. He was dressing rappers, athletes, entertainers, primarily African American ones. So LL Cool J, Mike Tyson, I think that's the only athlete I can actually say the name of. TLC, I think, or was it Salt and Pepper? Some of New York's biggest gangsters. And what was really unique about Dapper Dan's work is that he would do things like buy the garment bags from Louis Vuitton or Fendi and then repurpose them into really crazy garments. He developed a special printing process for leather, and then he would knock off the logos from Fendi or Gucci and then put them onto completely crazy new garments. And these weren't like dupes or knockoffs. He wasn't making copies of anything available at these luxury houses. He was imagining them in a way that they possibly could not have. And he was also designing for a community that they purposely excluded. And also thinking very carefully of sort of what these things mean to that community. And hold on. Now we get to the nuts. So the first sort of big heading thing is the idea of transformation. So the cool thing about Dapper Dan, so how this kind of relates is he is this African American designer, but before he became a fashion designer, he was just like a young hooligan, ended up in jail for some time, decided to fix his life. His mother was a Garveyist, so Garveyism is a African American sort of political philosophy where there was sort of this movement for African Americans to invest in their own communities. So buy black, support black, etc. So he obviously has this sort of political background informing his interests. And he started writing about Garveyism, and then he got the opportunity to take a tour of some African countries in the early 60s, which is again around the time of the Year of Africa. So he gets to come to the continent at this very exciting time where there are all these newly liberated nations. There's a lot of thoughts springing up about Pan-Africanism, about indigenous knowledge systems, about new ways to structure the world, a lot of post-colonial thought. And he gets to tour places like Tanzania and I think Kenya and Uganda as well for a bit and engaging with the people there. Then he also comes back to Africa in the 70s again. And this is also around the time of the Black and Beautiful movement. And that's where we see African Americans starting to embrace their continental heritage. So, excuse me, they're wearing their hair out in afros. They're listening to music from the continent. You know, one of the biggest pop stars at the time is Miriam Makeba, who's from here. They're wearing things like the shikis, and they're trying to connect to indigenous knowledge systems and spirituality. And Dapper Dan was supposed to be in, I believe, Kinshasa. So that was then Zaire, which is now DRC. And you're supposed to go watch a fight between, sorry, my athlete knowledge, terrible. But yeah, you're supposed to go watch some boxing fights. It gets canceled. He's like, I'm going to take a little extended vacation. He spent some time in Liberia and Nigeria, specifically in West Africa. He starts to see the way a lot of the locals are tailoring their clothes. They're putting together these really amazing fits. He's spending time with the tailors there. He's getting to know the fabrics. He's getting to know their sort of the way they're approaching personal style. It's like some really amazing things. There's this sort of blending of sort of this globalized context because they're now in this sort of modern world, but then also infusing their heritage in that, returning to older garments, getting into really crazy shapes and stuff, and also coming up with things that are completely new. And he's interacting with that, and then he decides from there that like when he gets back to New York in America, he's going to be a designer. And he comes back, and then he also just realized it's quite hard to break into the industry, especially because a lot of the African Americans he's trying to serve only really want to buy the things like Gucci. They want to buy the Fendis and the Ferragamos. Um, and he's starting to kind of see that there is a power in logos, there's a power in these symbols. And he decides that these symbols hold so much status and they sort of sway the way other people like view us, and they also act as a visual language. Like you and I don't have to speak the same language, but when you see me in a certain t-shirt and stuff, we might be able to reach some sort of understanding, or there's certain things that you will glean from that. So he decides that these like companies as well have also historically excluded us, and they exist as part of a system that doesn't treat us well, and I want to transform those symbols. I want to take them, I would like bastardize them and then make them into something that speaks to me and actually serves me in my community. Like one of my favorite things Dapper Dan did was he made Kevlar jackets, so like bulletproof vests, Gucci logos. One day, some rapper's girlfriend was in his store. And she was carrying a little Louis Vuitton purse, and he was like, "What if I change your car seats to match her bag? Like, what a great flex would that be? You know what I mean?" And just really thinking about really cool, crazy stuff there. And when you come back to sort of the continent, this idea of transformation happens a lot, especially sort of following liberation and rebellious movements. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Herero tribe in Namibia. Yeah, so you'll find really beautiful image of them, but there are a lot of these Namibian women who dress in quite this like Victorian style clothing, and they still do that to this day. And the Herero were victims of a very, very brutal genocide. So it goes to just say that the level of colonial influence and violence in Namibia was quite extreme. And so these women take these clothes that would have been forced on them at some point, and that would have been brought over to them by these colonizers who would have said things like, well, you guys are naked savages, and here we are to civilize you with our culture, our things. And when you're wearing these things, it's a show of how much power we have over you. And these women, in turn, take this and transform this. They add their own cultural hats. They imbue symbols of their own religious practices and spirituality. They take a certain deal of pride and care in the way they construct these garments for themselves and wear them in a way that sort of spits in the face of what was imposed upon them. And that's sort of like one aspect of transformation that you kind of see. Another really a good example here locally, and this is detailed by the historian Erica de Greef, but in the early 20th century, so like sort of towards the beginning of apartheid, a lot of young Black men, as you know, had to leave homelands, had to leave rural areas and move into the cities to go be laborers in mines, etc., whatever. And part of that means assimilating into the white Afrikaner society, which also means abandoning your cultural dress and going in favor of like suits and trousers and shirts. And what happened was there was a really beautiful phenomenon of these embroidered pants that people would do when all the Xhosa boys were going for initiation. So they would take these Western pants that these men would now need, now that these boys are becoming men and they're going to go into the working world, but they would cover them in the most beautiful, like cultural beading and embroidery work and sort of find a way to still retain elements of who they are while they have to adjust to this new context. And it's just sort of this bold way where you get to live in this sort of permanent act of rebellion. Like, yes, I am under this system and I have to abide by these laws, but you cannot make me forget who I am. You cannot separate me from where I come from. And that's also just sort of another element of transformation. And sort of to bring that to a point, I really like something that Dapper Dan does say, where he says, speaking obviously about the American experience, but I think it has applications across the world. We came to this country as slaves. We didn't have our own language. We didn't have our culture. We have to take those elements of this new culture that's been forced upon us and use that to recreate a culture for ourselves. And also, what I like about that is because when you think about all these sort of like colonial Western impositions, a lot of them are also the results of labor of people of color of global South communities. A lot of the silks that were favored in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries were from India, were from China, from Japan, right? But they somehow are a symbol of Western elegance. But then that wouldn't happen without the labor of people of color. So you get to appropriate this culture because it's also your making as well. As much as it is being used to oppress you, you actually have ownership of it. And I just really like these examples of using transformation to take those things back, to appropriate sort of the language and the words of your oppressor. Which brings me back to my second theme, which is theft. I'm a very, very big fan of plagiarism. I think plagiarism is a very important part of fashion. And I know we live in quite a sensitive time, I think, where everyone is very obsessed with originality. I think, actually, do you guys know who like the first fashion designer is? Anyone? Nah, good, cool. But in the sort of European global context, Charles Worth Frederick is considered the first fashion designer or the first couturier. And that's primarily because I guess he was the first guy who thought to sign his name on garments. So he kind of created the clothing label. And he was dressing a lot of the elite and nobility of Europe in the Victorian era and the early 20th century. And it's very interesting that they would automatically pick a man in what was a very, very female dominated industry. And perhaps you would say maybe in the Western context, an actual first fashion designer would be someone like Rose Bertin, who was responsible for all of Marie Antoinette's gowns, which were like, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they were absolutely magnificent. And she's kind of like the world's first fashion influencer. But we know how the fashion industry feels about women, obviously, despite being their main consumer and source of labor. They didn't do anything ever. But a problem also that comes with this sort of invention of the fashion designer is the idea of fashion being the result of an individual effort. Even now, when we talk about brands like Fendi, Moschino, actually, even now, Versace, Donatella Versace has just stepped down as creative director. Oh no, tragedy. Um, but again, we spend a lot of time when we talk about fashion collections, when we talk about runways, when we talk about the amazing work of a brand, we often speak about that as just the work of the creative director. We make a lot of big fuss about how a creative director has power and influence and everything. But fashion has never, and it still doesn't operate that way. It has always been the result of millions and millions of hands. Even if you are like a designer or anything, any idea that you come up with is not 100% your own, right? It's informed by everything you've been around. It's been informed by the things you're watching. Um, it's informed by the things you learn from around you. And we used to kind of live in a system, which is why I think we didn't have sort of these fashion designers before. And I think even in Africa, that wasn't really a concept until like maybe the 1960s or 70s, this idea of like one individual creative director, because I think people had an understanding that this was a communal effort, right? So this idea of also like and there was a couple years ago, I think it goes, Makosa wanted to sue Zara for, I think, sort of like plagiarizing a pair of his socks. That's obviously a very different context in terms of that being a huge mass manufacturing company that has way more resources than him. But it was an interesting conversation to me because it's also like, can you say you own that? Because of, I mean, it's so much of Xhosa culture, and that is so much of so many people's work over centuries and families and decades. And also, why do we want to own that? Shouldn't we want to share that? Shouldn't we want to spread that around? Um, and I think that's also a really good part. And another thing that's also very interesting, I think, also in terms of like the idea of theft, is that a lot of innovation and a lot of ingenuity happens when you start stealing, right? So there's that phrase, good artist copy, great artist steal, which I think a lot of people think means that like the better you are at making like a direct copy of something or making an absolutely perfect knockoff, the better an artist you are. But what that actually means is that if you think about the word stealing, when you're taking something, you make it your own, right? You're making your possession. So when you steal as a designer or something, what you're doing is you take the work of someone else and then you transform it through your lens, through your eyes. That's what the stealing aspect is. And but in order for that to happen, we have to start understanding that culture is a thing that's meant to be shared, and it's also a thing that's meant to be transformed all the time. A lot of things that come up in with my work is people think that when I'm talking about fashion history, I'm talking about something that is stuck in a moment of time that doesn't change. People think when we think about all the outfits that we wear for weddings and all these kinds of ceremonies, people think that they've always looked like that, but they are constantly changing. They've always been trends, right? I think you can even look at something like I look at like Shibelani skirts, like the way the lengths have changed, the use of materials. When my mother was younger, it used to be a thing where the girls would like feed them for each other. Now people can go get them like sort of mass made, etc. Or you can get a really beautiful rich Nisi version if you have 50 grand. And if you do have 50 grand, I think we should be friends. Just like, you know. But again, so these things aren't stagnant. They're constantly changing and they need to keep changing. That's how you keep culture alive. The moment we lock something up and we put it in a box and we don't interact with it or put our own sort of perspective on it, it will die. And that's kind of how we've lost certain elements because a big sort of part of the apartheid project was taking all the different ethnic groups, right? Also completely grouping them in very weird ways that suited their needs. And then also sort of trying to box up and categorize and typify what are examples of their culture. So coming up with these ideas that like Ndebele beadwork is completely different from what Sutu people are doing. It's completely different from what Zulu people are doing. It's completely different from what's happening at Shona people. When if you have to remember, these people all interacted, they moved in around each other. Some of the skills that Zulu people were learning was because they were interacting with Xhosa people, with Tswana people, and these things. And then they were also able to come up with better skills and better practices because of that interaction. And also, what we miss out then also is the chance to connect as well. Like, let's look at the symbols that we share. What else could we build together? Let's look at the ways that we're different and the ways that we're apart and come together. You know, this idea of like distinguishing and sort of having these hyper distinguishing thinking groups or whatever just only kind of serves to kind of separate us and sort of feed into ideas of tribalism. But then, of course, the appropriation conversation always gets kind of uncomfortable. So, like with the Zara example I mentioned, you know, how do we interact? How do we ever have cultural exchange with people who only seek to have power over you, who seek to oppress you, who seek to take, right? Someone actually said this to me the other day that, like, um, the thing about apartheid systems is that like everywhere else in the world, even when there was slavery and things in the past, like people got stuff in return. I mean, not always the best stuff, but there was a better exchange. Whereas here, it's like there was a lot of taking and nothing in return. But that's also to say that I think obviously I'm very into the plagiarism and I'm very into the appropriation, but obviously it's always the idea of a power imbalance. And what makes, I think, a good sort of appropriative relationship is when there's an exchange. So I give you something and you give me something in return. And we both are working from a place of equal power. And then my last little big heading is waste. So I know it's like a thing that everyone who's sort of from a like non-white community will talk about, like my family keeps plastics in the cupboards and we reuse this. Like it's actually a practice everyone does and everyone thinks it's completely unique to them. But I promise you, every house in the world, like there's a plastic drawer. um, but the point is also like again, what I like about that is just sort of it's kind of an inherent thing to people to think about waste in a creative way, and it's kind of more of an invented concept for us to think of like having things that we throw away and never think of again. You know, this idea of like I cannot describe the shock I had when I learned some people just literally throw away clothes when they're done with them. And I was like, and people do that. Like that's just in the bin. Like that's the thing. And that's not something that would have ever happened a long time ago. Obviously, part of that is because before like the Industrial Revolution, it took a really, 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 really long time to make clothing, right? You had to farm the animals or farm the plants. We didn't have the advantage of synthetic fabrics or synthetic fibers. Um, then after that, you had to go through the process of hand weaving things or knitting them, and then the dyeing and the spinning and the carding, long process, everything done by hand, and then the sewing, right? And what's really interesting is that despite the fact that it used to take so much longer to make clothing before, people of the past wore a lot more clothing than we do, in the sense that they wore a lot of bigger things. If you think about like Victorian or 18th century fashion, they had the huge panniers so wide you couldn't like go through a doorway. If you look to like 17th century West Africa, these huge wide-shouldered agbadas, women in these long trailing kaftans. You look at things like Indian saris, just meters and meters of fabric. Shevelanis in the past used to be made up of 50 meters of fabric. That's 50 meters, like condensed into a skirt. And this is in a time when people had to do all of that like this. And I guess maybe it's because they didn't have TikTok or something, which is like their last. But it's quite impressive. And what you see now today is that like we have more technology than ever before, but we're making much smaller clothing, right? The majority of things that you buy in shops are either something that's stretchy and it's basically some sort of rectangle that's meant to like, you know, go over your body, or it's some sort of sack like a t-shirt or whatever, something that requires minimal labor, can be put together quickly, but it's small and it doesn't have a lot on it. Like it's not a common thing to go into a store and see things that are like everything embroidered and beaded, or special dyes and printing techniques, unless you know you're going somewhere very high end. But for people of the past, that was just everyday wear. Um, and so also the what I was trying to think about, like with for people who had so much more work to do, like why would they have such big things? But also so that that's actually a sort of a form of waste management. Especially when you look at like the African context, people spent a lot of time dyeing, beading, embroidering, printing and painting on fabric. And after you've done all that labor to make this beautiful cloth, like you don't want to cut into it. And also, when you don't cut into it and you make these big garments out of it, what you also have is something that can keep getting used for many, many generations in many contexts. So if the trends change, you have this giant cloth that you can sew up and do this and that. You have something that you can hand over to your children because it's kind of like one size fits all. You also have something that you can keep adding onto because it's just a big square, something like that. So already just from the beginning of the process, you're thinking about like waste in a different way. And I forgot that actually I saw my dapper down today. But like also one of his sort of first things was because obviously he wasn't gonna get access to like Gucci or Louis Vuitton's dead stock or their inventory. But what he did do, he was using their shopping bags, he was using their garment bags, like things kind of not really made to be imported or things meant to be thrown away. And then he was finding really creative ways to use them. Like he made a really cool fur trimmed, or was it, I think it was fur lined jacket out of the washing bags. He would sniffle different parts of like the logos and things. Um, and take things that people thought of as waste or of low value, and make and show how they could be important and beautiful. And I feel like that's kind of sort of the same thing that happens in a lot of political movements where a certain group of people is thought of as inferior or low value, and then they have to show their beauty and their power and their dignity. And that sort of just translates really well to fashion. And you see this a lot, especially in history. I think I like to always say that like Black women are probably some of the most well-dressed people in all of history, and a lot of that I think has to do with how much restriction that they've had to work with. So a while ago, I spoke about in the 18th century, there was sort of a group of emancipated Black women. So these were women who were freed from slavery, a very tiny group of them in 18th century Cape Town. I think there was about like maybe 100 of them in the city, and they had to actually enforce laws to dictate how these women were dressing because they were dressing so well it was upsetting all of the settlers. That they actually had to put it into place. And some of the laws were things like they weren't allowed to wear colored silks anymore. They couldn't even wear fake jewelry if they wanted. They had to not get so like elaborate with their hair. I think they had to restrict them to certain amounts of colors, etc., which shows you that obviously that these women had access to these things and that they were wearing them really well. And obviously, it becomes a problem if the people you are oppressing dress just as well as you, because it's like, how do we distinguish who's more important here? And if you can visually present as my equal, then like, what if you actually are my equal? Then what are we gonna do? You know? And I think that's another like it's quite funny. And then there's also like other instances of like so in parts of like West Africa, a lot of like Italian silks would get dumped there, like the stuff that wasn't fit enough for them to use, or the stuff that was just low quality or unsold. And women would actually take apart these silks, like thread by thread, and then they would reweave them into kente designs. And again, so they're like, oh, you guys think this is waste, and you're giving this to me because you think like that's what I deserve, and I'm gonna make something absolutely amazing and beautiful and in my like visual language out of it. There's also a similar practice, I think, in Niger, where women take apart Indian madras cloths, and they do also a similar thing, and they make interesting patterns out of that. Um, what's another really good example? Like even I think if you think about even some of the fabrics that we kind of associate with African fashion, it's actually earlier Colin had the fabric map of Africa up. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that graphic, but it's sort of like it gives a fabric to all the African countries. It's my biggest up because it's like ridiculously inaccurate. Um, and also it leaves out a lot of countries. But for South Africa, you have Sheshwe. I think for parts of Nigeria, you have Ankara, which you might know is Dutch wax prints. And there's a few other instances. And but mainly with those two that I've mentioned, those aren't indigenous African fabrics, right? These were all brought over through various missionaries, colonizers, and through trade. But they have come to be a very important part of African fashion. And part of why Dutch wax prints came here was because they didn't do well in Indonesia. So the Dutch were copying Indonesian fabric printing techniques, couldn't do it as well as they did, tried to sell it back to the people they sold it from, and they were like, what am I going to do with this? And then they come here and then they dump it here. And you know, the especially the West Africans really enjoyed the cracking effect, which was a mistake by the Dutch. And then they started turning it into their own practice, and then they started incorporating that into their own dyeing techniques. And then that's where we get these African boutiques from, sort of, and then coming up with an entirely new visual language. But again, that's sort of where you see people taking waste or taking things that aren't sort of cared for, regarded highly, and transforming them into something really amazing and beautiful. Even then, again, you look at Shweshwe, brought over through various like Dutch and German missionaries and traders, primarily used to sort of Christianize different Tswana, Sotho, and Xhosa groups. But now people go absolutely bonkers with the way they design the stuff. And even to the point where when they were like manufacturing Shweshwe in Europe, to bring here to sell to South African or Southern African consumers, we actually had a lot of say and power in like what would sell well. Like they would actually get the designers to go travel Africa and go study the natives and see what they were into and get their opinions and their feedback. And and also like we got to decide like I don't like this print and that's not going to sell well. It wasn't so much just also being forced upon you, but again like taking this thing sort of just used to oppress you and then you get to transform it again. And I like to also think about that because we're also in a situation now where again we have the West dumping a lot of their stuff here. So we've got this huge problem of secondhand clothing waste, polluting the oceans, filling up the landfills, also damaging our local industries because they're offering like it's hard to compete with the very, very cheap prices of the stuff you find at like the bins in Noord, right? Like 2 rand for a top. Why would I ever go buy something from a like local brand, right? Um, and that's also an issue we're gonna obviously have to tackle, even though it's not our responsibility or our fault. But unfortunately, that's kind of a common theme in our industry. But I think these historical examples sort of show ways you can also look at these problems, that they're actually also a chance to be really creative, and that you might be dealing with these, especially when we look at a lot of like sustainability issues, we're dealing with a lot of these very big, scary, overwhelming problems, right? And a lot of them aren't even by our own invention. But what I do think is really cool is that we can make what can be our invention are the solutions and the way we move forward. And that also that these things present an opportunity to connect with your culture, to connect with your community, to craft a new narrative, to really dictate and shape the way of the future, right? Like Dapper Dan got to basically invent an entire fashion category through his work. Like I don't think we would have streetwear without him. I don't think the way hip hop fashion would look if it wasn't for him, right? And now we get to also be in that position to do the same thing. And I think it's also why I'd like to think that's kind of also why we're having this big African fashion moment. Part of me is like, perhaps the West has been in power for so long that they've just run out of ideas and there's just the novelty of it. Yeah, but I think also what we're seeing here on the continent, what we're all doing and what we're all capable of doing, isn't just fresh and novel because it's like, oh my God, we never knew about the Africa before. You guys don't have the lions and the tigers everywhere. And I wish I was exaggerating, but it's a very common conversation I have with people. Um, but also because like what we're doing is it's got value and it's got meaning beyond just products, right? We're not just making clothes for the sake of making clothes and driving profits. Obviously, unfortunately, rent has to be paid, so that is a part of it, but we're creating language, we're documenting history, we are finding bonds and connections. Even and I'm actually happy there's so many white people here because I also think another sort of disadvantage of like white supremacy and colonization is also that like white people lose their own cultural heritage too, right? Like if you're Dutch or Spanish, they have specific local traditions, but in order to be classified as white, you have to let that go and enter this generic blandness. So also without even having sort of like continental roots, there's also ways for you to connect with that or to find things from your own background and try use that as a way to bridge cultural divides and gaps, or also to interrogate and like reconcile the issues we face today. And that's what's really so cool about African fashion, because like you don't actually have to be African or Black to be involved. It's really a philosophy for everyone. And yeah, that's me. Okay. Bye. Ooh, that's such a great question. Let me stall. Uh, so thirsty. Okay, actually, I will. Yeah, I've got that. I think a big thing with South African fashion, I think is, and I know I just spoke about how great plagiarism is, but also an idea of ownership. So you know, like how recently we keep having these like diaspora wars with African Americans over the term colored, um, and their constant insistence that like, oh my God, you monkey savages, you're so oppressed, you don't even recognize that like these are slurs or whatever, right? And I think part of the reason why we're gonna, and I think especially like as you get more artists like Tyler rising up and things like that, you're gonna keep running into those things because we don't own enough of our own narratives. Like you know, one of my biggest tragedies, I used to want to work in fashion magazines growing up. Like I had big ugly Betty dreams, and then by the time I was like of age, like everything was gone. Elle was gone, Marie Claire, Glamour, Cosmo. I think there's something like three magazines left, and also what's inside them is tragic. Um, but again, yeah, so if we're not owning our narratives, if we're not leading these conversations of our own cultural products, then we end up in places like this where they also kind of can lose meaning and they can get appropriated by things. I spent like last year in Cape Town where you meet a lot of Europeans. And the way that these people from Berlin and Amsterdam would tell me about what Amapiano should sound like or what Gom should be, do you know what I mean? And because these things are getting appropriated, but without any sort of like establishing us as like cultural authority. And this is obviously a very complex issue, but I think in whatever you guys are moving forward through, like one, really think about like documenting and archiving what's going on around you, even if it's just on a personal level. Also think about like critically engaging with the fashion you're consuming. And like, I mean, like actually go out and have peers and discuss these things and talk about the merits and talk about what's happening, sort of spearhead conversations. Because also we need to keep talking about things. I'm a big fan of complaining. I think that's how we get things to start. So like, you know, instead of just being like, it sucks that there are no fashion jobs, like go cry about it and whine and whinge and go on and on and on about it. And then eventually I think someone will get so tired of you that they'll fix it. Um, so yeah, so that thing we need to get better at archiving and having more discussions and talking, I think, because I think right now there are so many amazing things happening, but like how do you find this information, right? And I think even some of that might be you guys, just even if it's just Instagram or something. Like I was so shocked the other day to find out that like AFI Fashion Week happened last week, and I was like, who knew that, you know? And it's like you see again, so I think that's a really big issue because also there's amazing things happening everywhere, but it's like we're gonna be in a place where like it's like there's a million channels on TV, but there's nothing to watch, you know? Yeah. Uh, no, that's a very great question. And I think part of it we'll have to also wait for the first Monday in May. But it's I mean, first I want to say also with the Met Gala, I think as much as it is a bit of a circus, it is still quite an important event. Perhaps, yeah, maybe we need to rethink the way we do this fundraising. But the Met Museum, the Costume Institute, does a lot of really important work. Some of like the most innovative ideas we have in how we preserve textiles and stuff comes from the work that they're able to do there. They have some of the most comprehensive archives and libraries. And since like 2010 to 2020, and I think since like the whole George Floyd thing, and I think that's also why we're having this specific theme now as well. I think they're feeling a lot of pressure about, you know, the way that they're viewed publicly now, etc. They have been doing a lot of work to include more Black designers. So like Tebe Magugu has stuff in there. They've got some I forgot what else, but there's quite a few things as well. They've also got some like other historical like African items in there, and they're getting a little bit better at documenting the sourcing and stuff like that. Yeah, I do. I mean, yeah, there's always, I mean, there's always demerits and merits to certain things, but I do think it is still sort of important to have this. The other thing I also think about that the Met Gala is important is that for the public, like the average person, this is kind of the most people will interact with, like craftsmanship and artisanal products. And it's a really good time to try and justify to people why these things deserve our time and investment. And yeah, again, I mean, there's obviously arguments to be made about better ways to come up with this. Why do we always have to have celebrities parade around while there are Palestinian protesters outside? You know, here and here. But with the Black Dandy thing, I'm also very interested because also from what we've seen so far, it doesn't look like there's a huge focus on the African dandy. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with like Black dandies on the continent. We have groups like Lesap in Congo. Here in South Africa, we've got Swenkers, we've got the Sartists, we had the Smarties, um, lots of cool groups. And I think also the idea of like dandyism is very quite central, not even just to African menswear, but like African fashion in general. What Black dandies do is in particular is using dress as a voice when they can't find one elsewhere, right? And being particularly flamboyant and boisterous, especially when they're not allowed to do that. And also just taking a very serious pride in themselves. And particularly, I know that like there's sort of this, and I think it's quite interesting because when like Black dandies do it, everyone's like, I can't believe these Africans, they don't have food, but they're spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on silk jackets and things like that. But what I like about dandyism is that like as much as we are people who have all these political things and these philosophies, think about like, don't we deserve joy? Do we not just enjoy the absolute pleasure of wearing a really nice coat? Do we not get to revel in those things? And also again, these things aren't frivolous. Like there is labor and there's ingenuity and there's culture in the things that we wear, and we just happen to be really good at celebrating it. Um, so it's going to be really interesting to see how much they feature that in the Met exhibition. But what I would say is that I think, and it's kind of growing a little bit now, but I think in the past couple of years we've had a lot of these African fashion centered exhibitions, but like none of them on the continent. So like Africa Fashion was at the V&A in London, and then I think the next place it went to was Brooklyn in America. There was another one in Afrofuturism in America. There was another one I think on different like diasporic and continental dress also in America, etc. Like a lot of these things are happening there. And what we have here in South Africa is a lot of museums sitting on these huge textile collections. Actually, it's a really, if you have time, there's actually two exhibitions on right now. I feel like everyone heard me complain last year and they were like, we're going to fix this for you, Khensani. But there's an exhibition at Museum Africa in Joburg called Fashion Accounts. And in that exhibition, what they've done is the museum's textile collection is divided in two parts. So there's the normal textile parts, which are all clothing from white people that has been donated and stuff. And then there's the ethnographic section. And I don't think I have to explain what a problematic name that is. And that's just a bunch of things like randomly collected, like no care to like what culture it's from or what it was used for, etc. And what they try to do in this exhibition is bringing those together and then trying to figure out like what are new ways we engage with the museum space. Because that's also the other thing is when we look at these institutions, they were never built to include things outside of this like apartheid Western gaze or desire or perspective. And in fact, a lot of the museums we have were specifically built to be a show of white supremacy and to put that culture on a pedestal. So like, should this be a space we even engage in? But also again, like where do we keep these things and preserve them for future generations and have the people with the knowledge to know how to repair things and keep them safe? So that's some of the questions they ask there in that collection, and I think that's like worthy of checking out. Second exhibition is at the University of Pretoria. Javisons. I literally just went there, said it's so good. Yeah, I should really go. It's amazing. And then they've got a bunch of different textiles. So they've got some like more cultural items, quite a lot of Ndebele garments. And then they've also got things like from embroidery collectives like Mapula Embroideries and Case Kama, some stuff from like Marian Fassler as well. That one I think is a little bit less sort of, I don't know if there's like a super political messaging. I think it's just mostly really beautiful. But again, I think a lot more institutions now are kind of, especially in South Africa, waking up to the fact that like this thing is popping off everywhere else in the world. We should get ahead of that, and we should also be taking charge of that because also like I spend a lot of time like going through the British Museum website, and you'll see a lot of things that are like apron, comma Africa, and that's it. And it's like, okay, whose was it? Was it a married woman's? What was it for? Which cult? Like, do you know what I mean? Whereas we have that knowledge here, and it's just collecting dust. So yeah, I think that answers your question, hopefully. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so there's a few things that I just right at the end, I think Khensani just for me, especially like looking at our BCom students and our students in general, just to say that our inventions are our solutions. I love that, and that's going on our website, and you'll be quoted. And we're that at the moment we're crafting that new narrative, and there's that as South Africans and African on the African continent that we're putting value